There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video was made possible due to those who support me on Patreon, and I'd like to give a big shout out to patrons Chris Hutchison, Cole V, Conrad Truitt, Dan Ray, Eric Navarro, Flake, John Deere, Joseph Abrams, Josh Draper, Majin Weeaboo, Ness Lee, and Stephen Dillon. Thank you all for your support. Full disclaimer, up until about 6 months ago, I had never seen a single episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. In retrospect, I must have just missed the boat, with Drake and Josh being my own personal Nickelodeon swan song. Despite being aware of the show's stellar reputation, I never had an excuse to circle back around to it. That is until I threw it in one of my community polls on a whim and was surprised to see it win by a decent margin. Poor Twin Peaks, always a bridesmaid. Upon reading the various comments from y'all, stating how you absolutely adore the series and that it was a fundamental part of your childhood, I figured that not only would my analysis bring an interesting perspective, as I would be watching the show sans nostalgia goggles, but at the very least, if the show was ass, I could revel in mercilessly obliterating your cherished adolescent memories. For those of you who think that sounds harsh, cope. Cry, pussy. You don't deserve to have an unsullied childhood. You deserve to feel how I felt when I rewatched Drake and Josh after finding out about all that sketchy Dan Schneider shit, and then when I got to the episode where the little girl movie star makes Josh give her a foot massage, my girlfriend questioned as to why I was having a mental breakdown in the corner of our living room. But alas, the show was excellent. Now, I do have my critiques, and I won't be pulling my punches. But putting aside its quality storytelling and astute character work, what struck me most is how the show was able to tackle such an array of mature themes while airing alongside the likes of prestige, highbrow programming such as The Fairly Odd Parents and that show with the big-haired fuck and his zoophile friend. Whenever someone gives me the usual BS about how children's media can only achieve a capped level of quality due to an adherence to its target audience, this is the show I will bring up to put that shit down. This video will serve as a complete review of the series, beginning with a breakdown of each book, followed by a dive into the arcs of our 4 principal characters, and concluding with a brief afterword. Just a heads up, I will not be taking into account any outside material, which includes the books, comics, and, of course, The Legend of Korra, as I feel it is only fair to analyze the series in isolation. Also, I have received some feedback about my long-form videos being overly recappy, so I'm going to try and tone that down for this one. I figure most of you watching have already seen the show, but if not, you may want to check out a YouTube recap for context. With all that said, let's begin. It's safe to say that I would rank Water as the show's weakest chapter, with the caveat that all 3 books are incredibly close in quality. Book 1 does a fantastic job of setting up the tale's major conflicts, but is held back due to its overly episodic structure. To be fair, this may be a matter of personal preference, as I am more keen on hyper-serialization. I actually think there is an art to melding serialized and episodic storytelling, where each episode feels self-enclosed but builds upon pre-existing story arcs, rewarding returning viewers with added richness, a style I would say Avatar perfects later on in its run. However, with Book 1, there seems to be a lack of causality. By that I mean you could watch the majority of the episodes in any order, and barring a few small details here and there, it wouldn't make that much of a difference. Hence why some of the most fillery episodes of the show can be found here in Book 1. Regardless, right out of the gate, Book 1 delivers quality storytelling. The first 3 episodes, which I view as a sort of makeshift pilot, efficiently introducing the main players and conflicts of the series. Something I see way too often in shows that explore some sort of high-concept premise, whether it be fantasy, sci-fi, what have you, is the writer trying to cram way too much world building way too early in the series, out of fear that if the audience doesn't understand literally every aspect of their world from the get-go, they will get confused and check out, which simply is not the case. On the contrary, it can often have the opposite effect, where throwing way too much at the viewer at one time can lead to them becoming overwhelmed and or leave a lot less time for establishing characterization and relationship dynamics. As long as you give the viewers the gist of your world, most will stick along for the ride with the anticipation of discovering more. Avatar holds true to this principle not only with its first few episodes, which don't go overboard with trying to detail every single aspect of its world, but even with its introduction. Okay, so we got these 4 nations who are all chill because this Avatar dude keeps the peace, but then the Fire Nation decided to go and be a fucking prick, and then the Avatar pissed off somewhere, and now the Fire Nation is kicking ass, and now we gotta find the reincarnated Avatar dude to make things kosher again. Got it? Good. Let's jump in. There seems to be the attitude that this sort of mini exposition dump at the beginning of your story qualifies as poor writing, despite it being utilized by some of the most memorable pieces of media in history. Granted, there are instances where it can be a bust. You tried your best, Virginia. But in most cases, your audience will appreciate you taking a few minutes to give them the general setup of your story in a clear, simple manner so you can hit the ground running. This restraint shown by the writers, where they don't throw too much at the viewer right away, is even more impressive when you consider the show's primary demographic. I'm sure many would be extra fearful that a younger audience would grow unruly and impatient if they didn't lay everything out from the get-go. It just goes to show that one of the deadliest mistakes you can make as a writer is underestimating your audience. The first 3 episodes do a fantastic job of setting up the main conflicts of the series, introducing the key players, establishing their personal goals, and conclude with our story kicking into gear, as Aang, Sokka, and Katara set forth to the Northern Water Tribe. From here, the show shifts into its more episodic style. The benefit of this structure is that it allows the show to give the characters their own focused moments of growth. Sokka having his sexist views challenged by the combative prowess of the Kyoshi warriors, Aang reuniting with his old friend Bumi and learning to think outside the box when it comes to problem solving, and Katara displaying her unwavering spirit to inspire Haru and his people to rebel against the Fire Nation, while simultaneously fleshing out the world. Us being introduced to a number of world-building elements, earthbending, how the Fire Nation subjugates the other nations, varying cultural attitudes among different peoples, without it ever coming off as forced or overly expository. However, the episodic structure does run into the issue of getting stale after a while. Hence why it was smart of the writers to circle things back to the primary story arc in the 2-parter episode, The Winter Solstice. Not only are we introduced to the spirit world, which becomes a recurring narrative element throughout the series, but, more importantly, Sozin's Comet. While on the surface, the Comet's inclusion may just seem like your standard ticking clock plot device, the writers cleverly decided to have the Comet strike at a far-off fixed time, at the end of the summer. While this nuance may seem inconsequential, it actually addresses one of the biggest issues I have with this type of plot device. The reason Sozin's Comet works so well is that it creates a sense of foreboding tension, but because it is set at a fixed point somewhat far into the future, it doesn't instill within our characters this pressing sense of urgency. If it did, then it would make most of the one-off adventures they partake in seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and them seem like careless idiots. Never mind chilling with the Kyoshi warriors, never mind reconnecting with Bumi, never mind helping Haru, there is a far more pressing matter that needs to be attended to ASAP. It allows the show to lend time to world building and character development while slowly building a sense of looming tension that gradually increases as the show goes on. A simple yet effective storytelling device. On a smaller scale, this is equally as true with giving our main characters a set end goal for the first season. Because of this, even as they stop to deal with more one-off adventures, the narrative maintains a sense of forward momentum. But, as I alluded to, the drawback of setting their end goal at the very end of the season is that it leaves a lot of story space for the writers to fill in. Hence why Book 1 has a handful of the more fillery episodes of the series. Case in point, our next episode, The Waterbending Scroll, which is by no means a bad episode. I like the exploration of Katara's indignation at Aang's natural talent for waterbending, but it wasn't nearly as impactful as previous character beats. Granted, the pirate crew they encounter does return later in Book 1. One thing the show excels at is reincorporating story elements to not only reward attentive viewers, but also give the show world a sense of coherence. But it's safe to say I found this to be the weakest and most inconsequential adventure thus far. And it was right about here when I began to get a bit nervous. Since I knew our leads probably wouldn't reach the Northern Water Tribe until the end of the season, I was dreading that the in-between would be mostly comprised of this type of episode. Low stakes, very little moral quandary, a whole lot of fluff, until we got to the real meat of the story. It was here that I began to fear that the promise the show had demonstrated up until now was a fluke. That in the end, despite its stellar reputation, it would be no different than any other kids show. And then I proceeded to have my fears mercilessly BTFO'd with Jet, which absolutely floored me in regard to how dark and heavy the show had the guts to get. To humanize the civilian population of the Fire Nation, rather than just frame them all as faceless bad guys that our heroes should pay no mind to drive home the idea that having trespasses inflicted upon you doesn't automatically justify you delivering the same treatment to others. The show could have easily kept the story as simple as possible. And yet, they decided to make things far more interesting and complicated than I could have ever expected, setting up inner and ethical conflicts that would hold relevance all the way up until the very end of the series. This was the episode that quite literally made me sit up in my office chair, like a shock to my system, that dispelled my initial belief that the series would simply become more trite as it continued, that made me ecstatically eager for whatever was to come next. But unfortunately, what came next was... Oh, fuck's happening now? Oh, man! So I need to correct myself. Earlier I mentioned that I knew basically nothing about this show going into it. Well, that wasn't exactly true. Despite knowing nothing about the plot, characters, story arcs, etc., the sole thing I knew about this show was that this episode sucked massive melons, its rotten reputation seemingly knowing no bounds. However, as I was watching the episode, I was actually kind of fucking with it. I loved the shift in gears, focusing on the Avatar's duty to not just crack skulls when necessary, but to serve as a diplomat who must be able to mediate peace between those left in the war's wake. And I thought the episode did a decent job of illustrating why this is such a vital role for the Avatar to fill, by emphasizing the more undesirable facets of the human condition, how petty grievances can lead to people bringing about their own mutually assured destruction, and that cooperation is the only way to circumvent it. Despite the Avatar being the top dog, he, like anyone else, needs to work with others in order to attain a world of peace. The Rashomon-like plot device of the two tribes having different interpretations of the same event, even accompanied by different art styles, was really cool. And the reveal that both sides were wrong, demonstrating how easily history can be misinterpreted, was surprisingly astute. As the episode was coming to a close, I was frankly confounded as to why the episode to this day inspires so much ire among the fanbase. That was until...
What? I made the whole thing up.
Look, I have seen a number of stories shit the bed come the home stretch, haven't we all? But I have never witnessed one doing so within the last, 20 seconds. The insanely nonchalant way Aang reveals that actually he was just fucking with the tribes, which is then not even called out by either Katara or Sokka. What the hell? What baffles me is how the writers could have ended it in a number of superior ways without even adding any extra scenes or dialogue. Why not just have the two tribes put aside their grievances after working together to survive? Why not just have Aang be telling the truth when he tells them what really happened, thus showing the tribes the error of their ways? Either one would have been a fine ending with a decent message. But instead we are left with I don't know, conflict mediation is a pain in the ass, so deception is actually based. I have seen many fans take umbrage with the ending, particularly because, putting aside any moral precedent it may imply, Aang lying in such blasé fashion is too out of character for him. But I actually think this would have been a fascinating angle to explore. There is a high chance that, if Aang didn't lie, the tribes would have continued to feud and eventually destroy each other at some point. Are there times when telling the truth isn't always the best option? Are there situations where a lie can be the right choice? And is it Aang's duty to do so for the greater good, even if it goes against his own personal philosophy? If the episode was just like 15 seconds longer and showed Aang weighing his decision to lie with Katara and Sokka, that would have been great. The episode leaving the audience with no clear-cut answer, but instead ethical questions to ponder. But alas, the episode stands as an exceedingly disappointing miscalculation. But luckily, the show immediately redeems itself. You know you have developed a truly captivating story when one of the finest episodes of the first season, perhaps even of the entire series, is basically a glorified expo dump. It was come The Storm and its follow-up The Blue Demon where the brilliant parallels between Aang and Zuko began to take shape. While the whole you and I are not so different after all hero-villain dynamic is basically a meme at this point, there is a reason it is so often found in media. Having your protagonist and antagonist not be the same per se, but rather act as two sides of the same coin, allows you to complement your character's attributes and explore more complex themes. So you can turn a simple story of cops and robbers into a meditation on the dangers of obsession, or elevate a superhero film into an exploration on the balance between order and chaos. In the case of Aang and Zuko, at first glance, there doesn't appear to be all that much these two have in common. Their disparate upbringings, demeanors, Aang as a kid, Zuko as a teenager. But upon having their stories put side by side, we see that they are both young boys lost in the world, trying to grasp onto something that will guide them through the storm, which, in this case, is the idea of destiny. Yet, the show illustrates how the idea of destiny isn't as cut and dry as one may think. How even if one's destiny will lead to everlasting peace and prosperity, it may come at the cost of detaching yourself from those you love, and perhaps the resulting isolation is something you don't think you will be able to bear. Or how pursuing what one thinks is their destiny can actually lead to them denying what is truly in their heart, conversely leading to only more inner turmoil. We see Avatar exploring the concepts of destiny and free will with maturity and nuance. And because of this, I was excited come our next episode, The Fortuneteller, as I presumed it was going to further explore and perhaps even critique the idea of destiny, how it can offer a sense of comfort to some while also leading others astray. But then it just didn't. At first it seems to poo-poo the idea of destiny, how the people of Makapu Village were almost led to their doom by the false predictions of Aunt Wu. But then at the end of the episode, there's the throwaway joke about how, while Aunt Wu didn't know the volcano would erupt, since the destruction of the village was averted due to the arrival of Team Avatar, her prediction wasn't technically wrong. Okay, so I guess the episode isn't saying the idea of fate is bunk, but rather it is something we simply cannot know for sure and have to buy into on faith? Like, okay, but then at the end of the episode, Wu is all like, Aang, you have the power to shape your clouds or something. And it's like, okay, hang on, wait, so which is it? Is Aang's destiny set in stone, or is it something he has control over? Did Wu learn the error of her ways? Or is she going to keep giving people fortunes when she has no idea whether they may lead to their happiness or doom? I don't even care if it was some, like, Forrest Gump, destiny and free will are both happening at the same time sort of thing. That was a bad impression, sorry. Like, just give us something. Yet despite the episode seeming to explore the idea of destiny and free will, ultimately it doesn't end up saying anything about any of it. Or if it meant to, it inadvertently contradicts itself. I guess I could just write this off as a filler or fun episode. I thought man crushing on Aang was pretty funny.
Don't flirt with him. I'm not going to... King hell.
Atheist core Sokka too. Bro's gonna start a YouTube channel on skepticism after this shit. But since it deals with such vital themes to the narrative, it's strange that it seems so flippant about what it's trying to communicate. Next up, we have Bato of the Water Tribe, which I was surprised to learn many in the fandom take issue with. Namely, Katara and Sokka deciding to leave to find their father, but then changing their minds in the space of like an hour. I think the story beat would have been better served with a two-parter. Have Sokka and Katara decide to leave Aang come the close of the first episode, and then decide to return in the second. This would give time to flesh out Sokka's decision to stick to his duty, and we would be given more time to explore Aang struggling with being left alone. However, I cannot agree with the other primary criticism of the episode, namely Aang lying to Sokka and Katara about the letter from their father. While many argue that Aang doing so is out of character, I actually contend this beat addressed my biggest issue with his characterization up until now. While we do see moments where Aang's carefree demeanor gives way to reveal his guilt and despair, for me, I found his attitude throughout most of Book 1 to be quite odd. Him appearing pretty chipper for a boy who lost everything he knew and loved in the blink of an eye. I understand that having Aang constantly being like, "Wah, my people were genocided."
That's rough, buddy.
Would be quite the downer, but I expected to see more of his grief and trauma. However, it was this episode that recontextualized Aang's disposition, how his wholesome and innocent demeanor is in a way a mask, in part how he copes with his despair. And it is here we see the fear that he has tried so hard to push down make him do something he knows is wrong. Him being unable to bear losing this new family that he has found. In contrast to those who feel this goes against his characterization, I would argue it only deepens it. Next up we have The Deserter, a solid episode that has plenty to offer. Aang struggling with his impatience, Katara discovering her healing abilities, and establishing Zhao's hubris. However, it does highlight one of my own personal series-spanning issues, namely the pacing of Aang's elemental training. Obviously, he is already established as a capable airbender from the get-go, and Book 2 does a great job of emphasizing the work he puts in to hone his earthbending. But when it comes to his waterbending and firebending, I can't help but feel him mastering them gets glossed over at times. This is a similar issue I have with Katara and her waterbending capabilities, namely how, throughout the series, it seems how skilled she is at any given moment feels rather arbitrary. Basically, she is as powerful as the writers need her to be for any given story beat. I can see the argument that watching Aang just sit around and practice his bending would get boring after a while. But since it is established that Aang mastering all four elements is crucial to him besting Ozai, I wish more time was spent showing the bitter work he has to put in to master them all. That isn't to say his training is completely ignored, I just wish it was given more precedence. As for the Northern Air Temple, I enjoyed Aang's indignation at seeing the temple being desecrated, not only because it emphasizes his despair over seeing everything he once knew fading away, but also because his adherence to his cultural beliefs comes into play big time come the finale. It establishes how strongly he holds to said beliefs. I also like the moral and ethical questions addressed, namely whether or not Teo and his group had the right to desecrate the temple, and the morality of Teo's father aiding the Fire Nation by making them weapons in exchange for the safety of his group. I felt as if the episode properly addressed the latter, not defending his decision, but simply showing how desperation can lead to people being forced to compromise their values. However, I have some gripes with the handling of the former. The episode ending with Aang stating he is no longer mad at Teo and the others for taking over the temple, as it is akin to a hermit crab taking refuge in a new shell. But the problem is,
Oh yeah!
like, they were pretty callous and disrespectful with their treatment of the palace. Like, I presume it was a place where others had lived, so I don't see why they would need to tear down walls and shit to make it habitable. It seemed like the episode's consensus was that Aang was being unreasonable, while conversely I think it was completely warranted for him to be pissed off. Even at the end when Aang makes good with Teo's father, if bro is like, hey yeah, next time we come across a place that clearly has a great deal of cultural significance, maybe we'll be a little bit less gung-ho about just demolishing it willy-nilly. Instead of having Aang and Teo's father respectfully disagree on their personal philosophies but come to a compromise, it was framed as if Aang was in the wrong. This is an instance of where it seemed like the writers tried to wrap things up too neatly. Instead of letting the viewer just sit with a situation that may not have a clear answer, they felt as if they needed to give a concrete lesson, if you will, for every situation. This was something that wasn't as much of an issue later on, but that definitely I saw a number of times in Book 1. And now we finally come to the Northern Water Tribe, where we remain for the last 3 episodes of the book. I liked how we were given an entire episode of Team Avatar being introduced to the tribe before the Fire Nation's assault in the 2-part finale, allowing us to become invested in the fates of the newly introduced characters, particularly in the case of Yue's sacrifice. I was surprised how much just spending a single episode with her and developing her and Sokka's romance made her fate in the finale that much more impactful. Even the conclusion of Zhao's arc was surprisingly poignant. Initially, he felt a bit too much like a run-of-the-mill stock villain, but this isn't that big of a deal, since the show is obviously saving the bigger baddies for later on. Regardless, he was still drawn as a capable antagonist whose hubris led to his own end. The finale also solidifies what I consider to be one of the series' biggest strengths, which is delivering truly pulse-pounding climaxes. The finales of Books 1, 2, 3, and even the mid-season climax of Book 3 all being properly epic culminations of everything leading up to them. Something I feel that has been lost in a lot of media, where the climax feels almost like an obligatory afterthought whose only purpose is to wrap up the story as quickly as possible, instead of serving as an absolute apex of growing tension and conflict. Overall, despite my smaller critiques, Book 1 is a solid season of television, with an efficient setup to the story, an array of memorable character and thematic arcs, and capped off with a perfectly structured and appropriately epic finale, setting our characters on a new central quest while teasing an even more formidable foe for them to contend with. And yet, I was still hesitant about heading into Book 2. While Book 1 was filled with brilliance, it did feel like it was holding back, not just thematically, but structurally. While there's nothing wrong with strict episodic storytelling, it did feel as if the writers weren't showing their full hand, if you will, which isn't inherently a bad thing. In fact, coming too strong out of the gate can lead to a show only becoming more disappointing as it continues. But I was fearful that the show would maintain its status quo, not push the envelope structurally, which would in turn prevent it from evolving, from reaching its full potential, from becoming something truly special to behold. And goddammit was I once again elated to be proven wrong. Book 2 is, for me, not only the strongest chapter of the series, but one of the best seasons of television of all time. It doesn't just match Book 1 in almost every facet, but straight up blows it out of the water, particularly in regard to its structure. It's simultaneously the most cohesive and coherent, yet gutsy and experimental saga of the show. The season starts off strong with the Avatar state, which circumvents what could have been a fatal flaw to the overall narrative. Whenever you decide to include an OP trump card in your story, which in this case is the Avatar state, you need to pair it with an Achilles heel, if you will, because if you don't, as a writer, you can just whip that shit out whenever you need it, which will more likely lead to lazy and cheap writing. By establishing it as a high-risk, high-reward scenario, you keep it balanced, ensuring that it is used sparingly, and when it is used, the characters and the audience know the cost of doing so. The Cave of Two Lovers is fine, I suppose. I really don't have all that much to say about it, so I guess I should use this as an opportunity to get this potential hot take out of the way. I am not a fan of Katang.
Turn that off.
I know many fans agree that the romantic subplots were one of, if not the weakest facet of the show, but even so, I thought this pairing in particular was completely out of pocket. I get Aang having a crush on Katara, but her reciprocating? It just never rang true to me. I have heard the argument that come the end of the series, Katara has learned to embrace her identity as a young girl as opposed to the surrogate mother of the group, and that Aang matures quite a bit over the course of the show, but I guess I was just never able to look past the older sister little brother dynamic established from the get-go. It isn't even really an age thing, I just never felt the spark between these two. Then again, I am talking about a 12 and 14-year-old, so maybe me being 31 leads to my adolescent romance calibration being more than just a little bit off kilter. Regardless, I was flabbergasted to learn that not only did the writers consider their relationship endgame from the very beginning, but the relationship I did stan, which I thought was palpable in any scene they were in together, Zuko and Katara, aka Zutara, or Katuko, or my own personal name for them, Zathura, was never something they even considered. Maybe I'm just out of touch with the Utes, I don't know. No. Everyone else is wrong, of course. Return to Omashu was the first big surprise of Book 2 for me, for two reasons. One, it was the first instance of our heroes returning to a place they had already visited. Not only does this retroactively make the seemingly standalone adventure of Book 1 feel more purposeful and deliberate, but it gives the show world a sense of depth. Us witnessing the contrast of how a place once was versus how it is now. It makes the world feel like a cohesive, living, breathing place. And two, it was when I realized that Book 2 was going to be nothing like I was expecting. Given the structure of Book 1, where our heroes only arrived at the Northern Water Tribe come the end of the season, I figured Book 2 would be the same deal. Our heroes setting off for Omashu, which they would only reach come the final few episodes. Bumi would teach Aang earthbending, the Fire Nation would attack, and Team Avatar would defeat them, with everything leading up to the climax being episodic one-off adventures. Basically, I figured Book 2 was going to stick with the same safe and derivative structure of Book 1. And here, only 3 episodes in, did it completely upend my expectations. It was at this moment that I knew Book 2 was not going to be anything like I figured. But I didn't know just how ballsy it was going to end up being. Suffice to say, it was here that I knew I was in for one hell of a ride. The swamp was decent, particularly for highlighting Sokka and Katara's respective past traumas that become consequential to their arcs later down the line, as well as setting up the introduction of probably my favorite character of the series. Like the Fortuneteller, the swamp also hints at the idea of determinism that runs throughout the show. Does Aang seeing a vision of Toph mean that everything that follows was always meant to be? Or was it simply some sort of force guiding him to a particular point, but unable to control how he would act in the moment? Destiny and fate can be tricky themes to mess with, and I'd say work best when you as a writer leave it mostly ambiguous as to whether or not there is some grand design, and focus more on what your characters personally believe and how they behave as a result. In that respect, I find the swamp handles these themes far more adeptly than the Fortuneteller. And now before we get to all the really good stuff, we first have to discuss my least favorite episode of the entire series, Avatar Day. I hate this episode
so much. Flames on the side of my face, heaving breaths.
More than the Great Divide, more than the Fortuneteller. I hate it. Which is really heartbreaking when you consider how much potential it had to really shake things up. Up until now, we have mostly only seen people raving about the Avatar, about how the Avatar is amazing and infallible and the savior of the world. So when the episode introduces a village that views the Avatar in a negative light, I was really intrigued. Perhaps this episode will explore the idea that every choice the Avatar makes, even if it is approved by some citizens of the world, will inevitably be derided by others. That being a leader means making difficult choices that won't make everyone happy, and being able to deal with and accept that, going along with the show's larger thematic through line of tentative balance. But then the plot shifts into Sokka and Katara trying to prove Kyoshi did not kill Chin. It's like, okay, well, even if the episode doesn't dive deep into the responsibilities of the Avatar, at least it acts as a cool mystery investigation scenario which is pretty original. But then at the end, Kyoshi just shows up and is like, "Nah, I did kill that motherfucker." And I was like, "Oh shit!" And I was like, "Oh shit!" Like, never mind. Maybe this is the point where Kyoshi teaches Aang a lesson about having to make hard calls in order to keep the peace, even if it means earning the ire of some of his constituents. But then it is revealed that Kyoshi didn't actually technically kill Chin. He accidentally offed himself by standing on an unstable piece of land. Like, not only is it annoying that even Kyoshi herself says that she killed Chin, which, like, this is like manslaughter at most, and that's like really stretching it. But it's so frustrating because it basically has Kyoshi doing jack shit to stop his reign of terror. Later on, they try to retcon this by having her in the finale be like, you know, I may not have technically killed him, but I would have. And it's like, bitch, that's cap. You were prepared to fuck off with your people and let him go on conquering as long as it didn't affect your bottom line. I presume this was as a result of the writers thinking, you know, we have to be careful about having the hero of our story just straight up executing someone. I can't say for sure what the thought process was behind all of this, but not only does it make the episode feel like a waste of a really cool concept, leaving the themes I spoke of out in the cold, but also undermines Kyoshi as a character. Also, this isn't even the script. I'm just like adding this in because I just thought of it. The fact that she, like, she could have like waited till the trial was over and then like told Aang and Katara and them the truth. Like, she could have done that, but instead she does it like in the middle of the trial, and then she just fucks off, and it's like, sorry, Aang. I'm like, oh, sorry, you're gonna get boiled alive. Shit, that sucks. Thanks, Kyoshi. Fucking bitch. This is the one episode, even more so than the other duds of the show, that I personally prefer to disregard and frankly wish I could just completely forget. Which luckily was easy to do, as our next episode sees the introduction of the one, the only, Toph is perhaps the most beloved character among the fandom, so I don't think I have to discuss every single thing that makes this little bad bitch the GOAT. But I do want to note two things that stuck out to me that make Toph such an incredible addition to the show. The first is the way she seamlessly melds in with the rest of Team Avatar. The chemistry between your show's primary characters, regardless of genre or format, is perhaps the biggest factor as to how well your show lands with the audience. And fucking with that chemistry in any way by either adding a new character to the mix or having a primary character make their exit can be deadly to said chemistry and thus your series. Which makes the way Toph joins the company of our heroes without missing a beat or any sort of awkward transition period insanely impressive. I would go so far as to say that this is where the show really hits its stride. Toph feeling less like an add-on to the story and more like a piece of the puzzle that's been missing all along. Sort of akin to the first time we saw Luke, Han, and Leia all interact for the first time in Star Wars. And secondly, how her blindness is handled in the narrative, namely how the writers don't shy away from highlighting it while not making it her entire character. Her blindness is shown to be a source of strength that has its own particular advantages, but also comes with its limitations. It is not invisible to her comrades, but they never coddle her or view it as a defining aspect of her personality, with many moments of humor sprouting from them straight up forgetting about it. The show uses her blindness as a source of comedic relief, not only by Toph drawing attention to it herself, but even making her the butt of the joke a number of times, something I can't see most writers daring to even try to do out of fear of being insensitive. However, I'd argue doing so gives Toph respect, not framing her as if she is untouchable or sacred, treating her like every other character in the show. Toph's blindness is handled so well, so effortlessly, it casts a looming shadow over countless other shows that utterly embarrass themselves in their attempts to circumvent the complexities of portraying a character with any sort of handicap or disability.
Spartans! What is your profession? I am a surgeon!
And despite how monumental Toph entering the story was, the writers somehow kept the hype train rolling with Zuko Alone. which for those of you who have seen my most recent video, I have added to my list of perfect television episodes. I'm actually low-key pissed that I went so long without bearing witness to this mini masterpiece. The standalone nature of the episode allowing us to take a deep dive into Zuko's psyche, emphasizing the good that exists within him, showing us he is worthy and capable of redemption, that a better life awaits upon his decision to forsake his old ways, only to deliver a devastating blow come its conclusion, as he is faced with a harsh reality. Even if he does decide to change, will the rest of the world allow him to? An absolute gut punch that sets up and really sells his heel turn come the end of book 2, which I don't think would have landed nearly as well otherwise. It's at this point where book 2's storytelling really takes off in my eyes, with almost every episode from here on out being far more serialized compared to the strictly one-off episodes of book 1. While those episodes did have little tidbits that connected to one another here and there, each episode from here on out feels more consequential in terms of setting up the next. Case in point, our next 2 episodes, The Chase and Bitter Work. While The Chase is a badass episode in its own right, with plenty of excellent moments, Toph and Iroh's chat, the team facing off against Azula, it also works as a stepping stone that leads smoothly into Bitter Work. That is not to say that jumping right into Toph training Aang wouldn't work, but it feels so much more natural for the show to first address Toph's initial struggle to mesh with the others, particularly the conflict between her and Katara. If not for this episode of seeing Katara and Toph deal with their initial hostility towards each other and eventually make amends, I don't think it would make Katara and Toph working together to help Aang with his earthbending training and Bitter Work as significant, nor would Katara and Toph's bonding later in Season 2 be as impactful. This is right around the time I felt the show was able to perfectly meld episodic and serialized storytelling, with each episode still feeling like a self-contained adventure, but with each subsequent episode building off of plot developments and characterization in a very natural manner. Each individual segment being a cohesive whole while still serving as a piece to a larger puzzle. We then move on to the library, where the writers introduce another plot device in order to keep the narrative fresh, in similar fashion as Sozin's Comet. In this case, we have the upcoming solar eclipse, setting up Team Avatar's invasion of the Fire Nation practically a full season in advance. Also note that, if you are familiar with my content breaking down 3-act structure, Team Avatar learning of the eclipse changes the trajectory of their journey, with them deciding to travel to Ba Sing Se and inform the Earth King of its impending arrival. Thus you could say it serves as an effective midpoint for the series. And, sure enough, our heroes make said discovery at almost exactly halfway through the entire show, demonstrating that you can still apply the fundamentals of 3-act storytelling structure even in a 20-something hour television series. The ending of the library leads directly into its follow-up, The Desert. Here we see yet another ballsy move made by the writers. If we were in, say, book 1, I would imagine that a scenario in which Appa is kidnapped would be wrapped up by the end of the episode. They would locate Appa, have a nice group hug, and that would be the end of it. But that is most certainly not what happens, with Appa remaining missing for nearly a quarter of the entire season, which means, heading into our next major story arc, our heroes have 2 disparate primary goals: locating the Earth King and informing him of the upcoming eclipse, and finding Appa. Leaving such a major plot thread to linger like this is not only unprecedented for the show itself, but impressive considering how many shows I have seen where the writers tried to do something similar, and instead of finding a clever way to tie it back into the main story, as Avatar does, they either shoehorn in some sort of contrived solution or just drop it altogether. This decision in particular demonstrated a very clear maturity in the writing. Moving on, the Serpent's Pass and the Drill, while each individually episodic, naturally lead into one another, establishing a clear forward momentum to the story. And then, finally, we arrive at the city of Ba Sing Se, where all the disparate threads and minor plots established thus far, our heroes trying to contact the Earth King but being hindered by the Dali, Zuko and Iroh keeping a low profile in the city, Jet and his gang resurfacing, the deadly Ozai's angels closing in, Appa still being MIA, are all about to collide. But before we come to our climax, we are treated to a calm before the storm of sorts, the lovely tales of Ba Sing Se. I have heard many refer to this episode as the most fillery of Book 2, which I guess you could make an argument for, but when the filler is this good, you will hear no complaints from me. My favorite segments being Katara and Toph's Girls' Day, and, of course, Iroh celebrating his son's birthday, which serves as an immensely touching tribute to Iroh's voice actor, Mako, who passed away prior to the episode's airing. Personally, I just love this episode for its originality, for doing something so unabashedly different and gutsy, something I can't even think of another show ever doing, pumping the brakes on the plot and taking a brief moment to allow the characters to shine. It is also placed perfectly within the season. It's sidestepping the issue I mentioned about how filler episodes can be detrimental to the narrative when there is something else our characters should be attending to with urgency. Since the show establishes that our heroes have to wait a month before they are granted an audience with the Earth King, there is an in-universe justification as to why they are able to take some time to just enjoy a day on the town. And I would even go so far as to say that it isn't as fillery as many claim it to be. Maybe in the case of Sokka and Aang's tales, but Katara and Toph's time together I found to be very meaningful in regard to each of their respective arcs, particularly Katara's, giving her a brief moment of levity where she is allowed to be a young girl, if only for a short time. Iroh's tale adds a lot of depth to his character, revealing that his more carefree yet generous nature is not just a personality quirk, but a defense against the grief he holds over losing his son, which in turn adds context and nuance as to why he is so adamant about saving Zuko. Even Momo's tale, besides giving a little focus to one of the show's more underappreciated characters, ends with the reveal that Appa isn't Ba Sing Se, building upon the mystery as to where he ended up following his capture and setting up his solo venture. Appa's Lost Days was another pleasant surprise, not only for its originality and how it was able to give Appa such a distinct personality. This is a fantastic episode to study in regard to how to convey character via action as opposed to through dialogue, but for once again using what could have been just a fun one-off adventure to set up major story beats, namely Suki re-entering the story and being captured by Azula, Appa arriving at Ba Sing Se and being imprisoned by Long Feng, and, primarily, having Appa encounter Patik before Aang does a few episodes later. One criticism I sort of let slide from Book 1, but that I will certainly not let slide in Book 3, is that despite how incredibly satisfying and epic the finales of each book are, some deeper lore elements feel like they pop up just a bit too suddenly, thus making them feel shoehorned in to bring about the intended resolution. But here, the show introduces Patik earlier in the narrative, thus setting up how Aang eventually comes into contact with him, which prevents him from feeling like as much of a deus ex machina as, well, another we shall discuss in time. From here, the last 4 episodes almost feel like a single unit building to the ultimate climax, similar to how the final 4 episodes of the series all act as the finale, as the numerous plot threads established throughout the book begin to weave and collide. Lake Laogai showcasing Jet's redemption and tragic death, a shockingly bold turn for the series. I especially love how they communicated his death without outright declaring it to the audience, as I presume that was a no-go for Nickelodeon. I know they poke fun at this later, but I actually admire the ingenuity as to how they go about implying his demise. We then have the Earth King, where our heroes meet with the Earth King, a payoff half the season in the making. Once again, we see the writers using callbacks to give what could have been a standalone episode of little consequence some vital storytelling causality. The Guru sees our heroes scattered. As threats draw near, Aang learning that in order to master the Avatar state, he must give up his connection to those that mean the most to him. A brilliant preamble to his ultimate conflict, where he must decide between duty and his own principles, with everything coming to fruition in the Crossroads of Destiny, which, if pressed, I would declare the show's finest hour. An unbelievable culmination. Katara and Zuko having it out, Iroh teaming up with the rest of Team Avatar. But the 2 main things that make this episode the GOAT for me are Zuko's heel turn and the gang failing to prevent Azula from taking over Ba Sing Se. As heartbreaking as it was to see Zuko turn against those we were hoping he would ally with, despite all the progress he had made since he and Iroh went into exile at the beginning of Book 2, despite him having a taste of a life free from the burden of his past, the desperation to re-enter his father's good graces was too much for him to overcome in the moment, thus resulting in a turn that in a lesser show probably would have come off as too sudden and contrived, but due to a number of subtly placed moments sprinkled throughout the series, makes it a devastating yet fair reversal. And then there is Aang's defeat at the hands of Azula. Despite the many unprecedented moments Book 2 had to offer, I was still taken aback, me being sure that Team Avatar would have to come out on top, saving the Earth Kingdom before setting off to their final confrontation, only to have this ripped away from me in true Empire Strikes Back fashion, as our heroes are left at a complete loss, leaving me, once again, utterly clueless, yet desperately eager to see where the story would go from here. As for critiques, they are few and far between. Obviously, Avatar Day is unfortunately part of Book 2, but since it is so inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, I have an easy time putting it out of my mind. Originally, I was going to cite the lack of development of Mei and Ty Lee as a flaw, me wishing they got a bit more time to shine in Book 2, but in retrospect, it wasn't that big of a deal, and I liked the way they ended up doing so in Book 3. But if I had one critique of what I consider an otherwise perfect season, it would be that I wish Long Feng was given just a bit more depth. Him keeping Ba Sing Se out of the ongoing conflict seemed to be more out of a desire for power and control, which isn't bad per se, but I wish it was more complicated than that. What if Long Feng decided to do so because part of him thought it was the only way to preserve the Earth Kingdom's way of life and keep its people safe? This could have led to a thematic debate about isolationism and the morality of staying out of a conflict if it means the security of your own people. It's a small critique, but I thought since Azula is more of a one-note antagonist throughout Book 2, giving Long Feng just a tad more complexity would have been pretty cool. But critiques aside, Book 2 proved itself as having the guts to defy convention, to take some truly astounding risks, and experiment with narrative and structure, all of which resulted in me being absolutely ecstatic heading into the concluding chapter of our story. This may be one of my more controversial takes, but while I initially stated that I find Book 1 to be the worst of the show, there are times when I flip-flop between ranking Book 3 as the show's weakest. While Book 3 contains some of the crowning moments of the series and wraps up most of the predominant story threads in rewarding fashion, when stepping back and critiquing it as a whole, it feels the most uneven and overstuffed. To be fair, you could argue this is as a result of Books 1 and 2 leaving certain plot and character threads underdeveloped. Thus, Book 3 had to pick up the slack to conclude everything in satisfying manner. Regardless, I find that Book 3 suffers from a lack of focus in regard to setting up the show's final showdown, particularly in its back half. Book 3 starts off strong with the awakening, setting the stage for the final battle to come. As I mentioned, I think delivering such a devastating blow to our heroes heading into the final season was a bold yet brilliant choice, allowing us to fully empathize with Team Avatar in regard to the insurmountable odds they are faced with. The premiere showing just how much said blow has affected and set back our heroes both physically and mentally. Next up is the Headband. This is one that I have heard mixed things about from the fandom. While it definitely feels like the most straight-up filler episode of Book 3, I find value in how it emphasizes that, despite the weight of the challenges they are faced with, our main characters are still just kids who yearn to maintain their youth and playfulness. While an impromptu dance party may seem trivial in such trying times, these brief moments of joy and innocence are vital to remind our heroes what it is they are fighting for. I also appreciate the episode for continuing to humanize the Fire Nation in such an organic manner. showing us how the citizens of the Fire Nation have been exposed to propaganda from a young age. It adds an extra layer of complexity to the ongoing war without it feeling too preachy or in your face. I found the Paint and Lay to be an all-around strong episode, which sits nicely with Katara's progression, demonstrating that while she may not be the most powerful of Team Avatar, she plays a vital role in keeping them together. However, I did feel a bit like we were retreading old ground, as the episode was very reminiscent of the Book 1 episode, Imprisoned, where Katara inspires Haru and his people. But overall, I think the episode is still rewarding, as it shows Katara extending compassion directly to those who belong to the Fire Nation, especially considering how her arc plays out over the course of Book 3. Sokka's master is, I would say, a perfect climax to Sokka's arc. While that is not to say Sokka doesn't have some great moments later on, it is here that, at least to me, he officially became the man he has always wanted to be. Not by showing off via some grand display of strength or ability, but by expressing humility and honor. As I will discuss later in his individual character segment, I think it was very smart of the writers to include a character who did not have bending powers, in order to show how even in their absence, one can still find a way to be a valuable member of any team. The beach was quite the pleasant surprise, finally giving Azula, Mai, and Ty Lee some substantial development. It makes their eventual dynamic shifts, namely Mai and Ty Lee deciding to forsake Azula, and Azula's eventual descent into madness, that much more impactful. And, like with the headband, it was a crucial reminder that the characters are, at the end of the day, just children, who have been denied their youth and innocence. Thus, it was nice to see them get a chance to enjoy adolescence in all its cringy awkwardness. Reminiscent of the storm, the Avatar and the Fire Lord is another example of how to make what is basically a glorified exposition dump work so well. I particularly appreciate how the episode explicitly explores the idea of the Avatar not being some perfect Gary Stu, Mary Sue-esque character, but rather utterly human, one who is not immune from allowing their emotions to compromise their judgment. However, while overall I love this episode, I do have mixed feelings about the reveal that Avatar Roku was the great-grandfather of Zuko. For one, it doesn't seem all that consequential to the rest of the series. I have heard some argue that it actually is significant, as it explains why Zuko has this raging conflict within him, as he is the descendant of both pure good and pure evil. But in that case, I actually think it cheapens Zuko's development. The show up until this point has done a fantastic job of exploring the idea of how circumstance is everything, how certain experiences can lead the good astray and the bad to salvation, how where one ends up on the path of life is never predetermined, and with enough willpower, one can always control their destiny. So the idea that the only reason, or at least a substantial factor, as to why Zuko has this propensity for good within him is because he is the descendant of Roku, the conceptual embodiment of good, seems like it undermines this idea. Personally, I don't think this is the implication the writers were trying to get across. It seemed like it was meant to be more for thematic, metaphorical purposes, but regardless, at best, I consider it heavy-handed and frankly unnecessary. The Runaway was decent, if a bit underwhelming compared to the highlights of Book 3. It wraps up the dynamic and conflict between Katara and Toph that was established in Book 2, with them allowing one another to tease out parts of themselves they had previously tried to keep dormant. But now we come to perhaps the most brutal episode of the series, the Puppetmaster, which somehow instilled in me the same level of astonishment this deep into the series as Jet did way back in Book 1. While Jet shows us how trauma can lead someone astray, turning them into someone they are not, the Puppetmaster ups the ante by having Hama be a stand-in, or rather reflection, for the person Katara risks becoming if she is not able to put aside her trauma and find a way to move past the rage her mother's murder instilled within her. A bitter, sadistic old woman whose only goal is to inflict the same pain that has been afflicted upon her unto others. I also loved how the ending, where Katara is forced to use bloodbending on Hama, echoes Aang's inner conflict in regard to killing Ozai. Katara was forced to compromise her values to save those she loves. The show not even offering a sense of catharsis or moment where the characters talk it out and find a silver lining in their ordeal. Rather, it forces the viewer to sit with the complex themes it is presented, displaying perhaps its most mature feat of storytelling yet. Nightmares and Daydreams is fine, I suppose. As much as I appreciate them highlighting Aang's anxiety about his looming confrontation with Ozai, I wasn't a fan of the overly comical way they decided to depict it. I actually think the show's ability to balance humor with its more serious beats is one of its finest attributes. However, in this case, I think they went a bit too far, the overly silly tone undermining the weight that Aang is struggling with. Perhaps the writers figured since the episode is sandwiched between the dark brutality of the Puppetmaster and the do-or-die showdown of the Day of the Black Sun, they wanted to offer it as a dose of levity. But for me, it was simply too much of a tonal contrast. However, I'd say Zuko's storyline in this episode more than makes up for it, as it is more in line with the tone I was expecting from Aang's. And now onto the mid-season climax, the Day of the Black Sun. The show once again demonstrating it is king when it comes to delivering satisfying payoffs. The return of so many of the show's one-off characters, the epic nature of Team Avatar's assault on the Fire Nation capital, the gut punch of a twist upon learning the invasion was all for naught, the other gut punch of a twist as we discover that Zuko's mother is still alive and was banished as a result of sparing him, the absolutely legendary scene of Zuko finally forsaking Ozai, and then to end the episode with another devastating blow, where we see the young characters forced to set forth on their own, leaving behind their parents, their mentors, left to face their greatest challenge yet, all on their own. How could the show have possibly encapsulated its primary theme of children coming of age and stepping up to face adversity any better? The Western Air Temple is a strong start to the back half of the season, delivering yet another incredible payoff, with Zuko finally joining our other main characters and making Team Avatar complete, followed by the Firebending Masters, where we finally get to see Aang and Zuko interact as friends and allies, a long-awaited team-up for these two. But then we come to the Boiling Rock, which I am not the biggest fan of. There is plenty to love in this episode. Sokka and Zuko's chemistry is entertaining as hell, Mai and Ty Lee finally turning their backs on Azula, and how it sets up her descent into madness, Sokka and Suki reuniting was great, and overall, the whole prison break plot is a fun adventure. But the cons of the episode keep me from heralding it as one of the series' best, as so many others do. First off, I have no idea why the writers thought this plot warranted 2 whole episodes, especially considering we are so close to the end of the show. But secondly, and primarily, not only do I consider it somewhat inconsequential to Sokka's arc, at worst, I think it is in contradiction to his established characterization. Consider, if we take what Sokka demonstrates in Bato of the Water Tribe, him deciding to forgo seeing his father in order to stick to his duty, then it makes the fact that Sokka would decide to go off on a dangerous mission to save his father when they are in such a dire situation with Sozin's Comet approaching and whatnot seem incredibly irresponsible. I could see Book 1 Sokka doing something like this, but not Book 3 Sokka, especially after Sokka's master. Now, the counter would be that this is an instance of Sokka displaying clouded judgment. Since he was so devastated by their failure during the Day of the Black Sun, he feels compelled to redeem himself, which is fine, but isn't this what he ends up doing come the finale by destroying the Fire Nation airship fleet and saving the entire Earth Kingdom? I feel it would have been much more rewarding if we saved Sokka and Katara's reunion with their father come the finale after they each respectively face their greatest challenge yet. It's even more bizarre considering Sokka saves his father, and then at the beginning of the very next episode, he splits to do, I'm actually not sure, nothing of consequence it seems, so it's not like Sokka saving him now, as opposed to following Ozai's defeat, makes all that much of a difference. Overall, this episode feels more like a bridge for a number of plot developments the writers need to put into place, namely Suki being rescued, and Mai and Ty Lee turning on Azula, as opposed to being essential from a character standpoint. I think there are a number of ways they could have structured the plot to make it more coherent with Sokka's arc. Perhaps there was a particular prisoner that they needed to save or get information from in order to facilitate their final push against the Fire Nation. And while they're there, Sokka takes the opportunity to free his father and Suki. This seems more in line with something he would do come this point in the series. I am not saying every episode has to be essential for characterization. However, considering the Boiling Rock is the last episode where Sokka is the primary focus, and it results in the show seemingly walking back some of his development, and the fact that it takes up 2 whole episodes in the final stretch of the series, for me, it seemed like an odd place to put a fun adventure, as this should be the point in the series where we're getting down to brass tacks. Speaking of getting down to brass tacks, next up we have the devastating The Southern Raiders. I have a number of gripes with how Katara's arc unfolds over the course of the series, which I'll go into later. But I think it is safe to say the writers completely redeemed her come Book 3, capping her arc off with one of the most gut-wrenching episodes of the show, where we see Katara's trauma begin to take hold of her, turning her into someone she is not, only to have her decide in the end to put aside her desire for vengeance and not allow her grief to destroy the person she has become. Despite all her rage, don't do it, her resentment over having her childhood stripped from her, she knew it would be a disservice to her mother, who made the ultimate sacrifice for her, if she sunk to the level of the one she has held such disdain and fury for so long. Even more impressively, like the Puppetmaster, it isn't an episode that gives a sense of total and complete closure. There is no indication that Katara is all of a sudden free from her trauma and pain. It likely is something she will struggle with for a long time, if not the rest of her days. But we now know that she will not let it destroy her, recognizing her faults, accepting the harsh realities of the world, and carrying on in spite of them. The Ember Island players, to its immense credit, probably delivers the most inventive execution of a series recap I have ever seen, simultaneously serving as a victory lap, showcasing its greatest hits, as well as letting the writers make a number of tongue-in-cheek jabs at their own show. I also think it works much better than Nightmares and Daydreams in terms of its humor, serving as a much more appropriate calm before the storm, considering it precedes the mega-sized series finale. And finally we arrive at our grand conclusion, which most certainly did not disappoint. Capping off almost every character's arc in tremendous fashion, epic square-offs, touching reunions, payoffs that were the entire show in the making, there really isn't much I can say to add to the immense praise given to the finale, often regarded as, and that I am inclined to agree is, one of the best in television history. But unfortunately, I do have to discuss the elephant, or should I say, lion turtle, in the room. Now, I totally understand the rock and hard place situation the writers found themselves in regard to Aang killing Ozai. Yes, the show did insinuate death and murder a number of times, but it is understandable that Nickelodeon would be hesitant to have the lead of their children's program straight up assassinate the show's big baddie. So I get that they had to sort of sidestep around that. But then again, maybe the writers never intended to have Aang kill Ozai anyway, even though it seems like the show offered some pretty persuasive arguments, not only as to why killing Ozai would be totally chill, but that maybe Aang is kind of being a selfish little prick for putting his own personal principles over doing his duty, and by hesitating he would be putting literally the entire world at risk, but hey, we'll talk about that later. And it was always intended for him to find an alternative solution, which personally I am fine with. Many have countered the argument that Aang not killing Ozai goes against the idea that there are times where one must go against their own wishes in order to do what needs to be done, by stating the ending demonstrates that with enough effort and determination, one can always find a way out of any predicament while sticking to their own personal philosophy. Which, even if I don't personally agree with this outlook, I suppose I am fine with in theory, if that's what the writers were going for. The issue is that energy bending as a concept is presented in such a blatantly Deus Ex Machina fashion, especially in a show that clearly appreciates and has demonstrated on multiple occasions that it knows how to pull off incredibly rewarding setups and payoffs. I think the ending would be greatly improved if energy bending was something that was hinted at throughout the series, or, at the very least, if it comes with great risk to the user. For example, maybe Aang using energy bending to dispatch Ozai comes with the possibility of him dying, similar to the Avatar state. Or maybe even costing Aang his own bending, which would then compromise his ability to keep peace as the Avatar. Oh, gotta pause right there and back up. So I actually penned that section following my first watch through of the show and didn't realize that I completely missed that there actually is a great risk of Aang using energy bending. As he is in the process of performing it on Ozai, we hear a voiceover of the lion turtle saying that if the soul of the user is not unbending, then it will result in them being corrupted and destroyed. Since energy bending itself was only introduced like 5 seconds prior, I think I was a bit at a loss as to what was going on to really pay attention to the lion turtle's voiceover, hence why I missed it the first time through. So this shows that the writers had the right instincts, not just introducing a majorly OP story element without substantial risk. However, again, it is more about how it is introduced. Since energy bending itself isn't explained until literally as it is happening, in fact, we don't even discover what energy bending really does until after Aang pulls it off, it comes off as more like a twist solely to bring about the writer's desired resolution. Hence, why many consider it to be a cop-out. I don't know if I would go that far, but I definitely think the way it was presented was far from optimal. As I said, I think if energy bending was introduced earlier, with Aang learning of and accepting the risks of performing it prior to his confrontation with Ozai, the tension coming from whether or not Aang will be able to pull it off before he is forced to kill his nemesis, it would have gone down a lot smoother. Still a bit of a deus ex machina, but substantially less so. Overall, Book 3 contains some of the show's finest moments, its most rewarding payoffs, and culminates in a, while flawed, tremendously satisfying conclusion. So why do I rank it below Book 2, and, at times, flirt with ranking it even below Book 1? Well, as I alluded to, that would be due to Book 2 setting the bar so high in terms of story structure, which is an area where I feel Book 3 is quite the step back in. For one, I really missed the forward momentum I spoke about from Book 2, where it felt like our characters always had a clear goal that got us through the more standalone episodes. In the first half of Book 3, our characters are basically just waiting around for the day of the Fire Nation invasion. While the looming assault still offers some sense of building tension, I don't think it was done as effectively as the build-up to the coup of Ba Sing Se. This problem continues in the back half of Book 3, where we once again feel like we are just waiting for the final showdown to arrive, as opposed to our heroes moving towards anything. I don't think this is an issue in and of itself, but it is compounded by the fact that following the failed invasion on the Day of the Black Sun, the show feels like it becomes too much like the Zuko show. Don't get me wrong, I love Zuko as a character and his arc, but I expected to have the lead up to the finale be more focused on Aang rather than Zuko having his standalone adventures with each of the other members of Team Avatar. I do think these episodes served a narrative purpose, both in the form of wrapping up lingering character threads and being necessary to allow the other characters to fully believe they could trust Zuko and accept him as an ally. But this led to the fully assembled Team Avatar not getting as much screen time as I had hoped, as the chemistry between the characters all interacting as a unit I found to be one of the highlights of Book 2. Or, at the very least, I thought that Aang and Zuko, given their clear character parallels throughout the entire show, would have been given more one-on-one time. I get that the writers needed to do a lot with that last stretch to wrap everything up before the finale, but it seemed like they were spread just a bit too thin, with the most unfortunate side effect I found to be Toph getting sidelined, her being the only main character to not get a solo adventure with Zuko. Like, if you're going to commit to that structure, at least follow through with it. I know they make a joke out of it, but still. I suppose the argument is that since Toph doesn't have as much direct history with Zuko as the others do, it wouldn't have been as notable or as significant as the others, which I suppose is fair. Another argument could be made that since her arc was basically wrapped up in the Runaway, there wouldn't be anything for her and Zuko to really get up to that would be consequential to her arc. I guess they could have had Zuko and Toph travel to have her make amends with her parents, but part of me actually likes just leaving it with Toph sending the letter. signifying that regardless of how things go with her parents, she has grown into someone who is willing to try and make things work with them, even if they always don't see eye to eye. Ooh, fuck, was that insensitive? God damn it, I was so careful. I have some more minor points, both good and bad. I thought the Combustion Man arc was kinda silly and got repetitive after a while. Also, I don't understand why the writers had Sokka take him out as opposed to Zuko. Wouldn't it have made more sense for Zuko to have dispatched him, which would then convince the others to at least tentatively trust him? For such a one-note flat character, at least that would have given him some sort of significance. I know Ozai's characterization is a point of contention for some fans, with many finding him to be far too one-dimensional, but frankly, I was totally fine with this. Despite my love for complexity when it comes to characterization, trying to apply this to every single character in a given narrative can come off as forced, and end up diminishing the nuance of your other characters. My one gripe with Ozai, however, is that I wish we got to actually see the extent of his power before his face-off with Aang. Yes, we are told countless times how powerful he is, but, as the saying goes, show, don't tell. There is a scene where he utilizes his lightning bending powers when facing off with Zuko, but I don't think that really shows the full extent of what he is capable of. An easy fix could have been to have Ozai personally be the one who wipes out the remaining Team Avatar forces during their failed invasion, instead of the airships. Not only would that demonstrate to the audience just how formidable a foe Ozai is, but having Aang see their entire invasion attempt be easily dispatched by Ozai single-handedly would really emphasize just how hopeless and terrified he would be heading into his final confrontation with the Fire Lord. I wanted to save my highest point of praise for last, so I didn't come off as too much of a hater. Said point being the show's handling of Azula, and in particular, her tragic end. I know the creators of the show have said that they were originally planning on setting up a redemption arc for Azula, and the question as to whether she deserves one is a contentious debate within the fandom. But for me, putting aside whether or not I think she as a character deserved to have a shot at redemption, and not taking into account anything that occurs following the events of the series, I am actually glad she met such a tragic end. Again, not because I think she deserved it, but rather because it serves as an important juxtaposition to Zuko's arc. The issue I have with some shows and redemption arcs is that it always seems all or nothing. Either a character shows the capability of redemption and they are given said redemption, or they are framed as an evil monster who never had any chance of seeing the light. And it is in this respect that Azula stands alone, and, in some ways, I actually think exceeds Zuko when it comes to her character trajectory, at least for me personally. It would have been easy to just keep Azula as the cunning viper that we meet in Book 2. But instead, Book 3 demonstrates that not all is lost, that there is still a young girl within her, trying to find her place in the world, who is capable of regret, plagued with the trauma of believing her mother thought she was a monster, who had her closest friends turn their backs on her, who was desperate for her father's approval, only to realize, ultimately, she was just a pawn in his game. I am not saying that she didn't necessarily deserve any of what she received. I am simply demonstrating that the show humanized her, allowed us to empathize with her, even if just a little. But while in a lesser show, this would be a telltale sign that Azula would end up seeing the light, instead, we see a young girl fall into despair, having no one by her side as she is left shackled in chains and falls into madness. The fact that the show dangles the possibility of Azula coming to her senses, just as her brother did, only to rip this away, was devastating, yet highlighted the brutal truth that even if one does have a propensity for good within them, that doesn't always mean that they will be able to turn things around before reaching the point of no return. It further emphasizes how meaningful and consequential Zuko's journey has been, that there was a chance of Zuko falling into madness himself, of running out of time. Again, I know the writers did plan on redeeming Azula, but as it stands, I consider the conclusion of Azula's arc to be the most ballsy of the show. While I do think Book 3 was a step back in a number of areas compared to Book 2, it was a miraculous and epic conclusion to the series, a series that I was glad to see almost always put their characters first. While I wouldn't say Sokka's arc is in and of itself all that original or groundbreaking, its inclusion in the show I consider to be one of its most understated yet standout creative decisions. In any series where there is some sort of magic system or precedence for metahuman-esque powers, it is understandable that a writer would be tempted to give all of their principal characters unique abilities that not only let them have a blast exploring how said abilities can be utilized in various ways, but also allow said characters to become OP badasses who ultimately unlock the full potential of their powers and use them to crack some skulls. And while that's all well and good, it shows a great deal of restraint to feature a character who is not given access to said powers, their arc showing that one can still hold value and be a vital part of any team, even in their absence. And it is in this regard that Sokka's arc stands out. Even from a young age, Sokka has demonstrated that he possesses the heart of a warrior, the will to do whatever he must to protect those he cares for. However, despite his fearlessness in the face of his enemies, what good is it if they can easily dispatch him via the force of the elements they hold at their fingertips? Perhaps in another show, we would see him attain the power of the elements himself, in order to level the playing field. But Sokka's arc rejects the idea that he needs said power to be of use. His journey is one in which he must put aside his ego in order to find an alternative way to protect those he loves. A journey that forces him to challenge his perspective, to question his lens of the world, to learn that being a true leader requires putting one's duty over personal desire. It is as a result of this shift in his worldview that Sokka begins to see the various challenges he is faced with in a different light. Rather than charging headfirst into a situation with an absent mind, Sokka learns to rely on his intellect to outwit his enemies, dismissing the arrogance of believing you are infallible, thus leading to him embracing preparation, the instinct to always seek a strategic edge over one's opponent, experiences that culminate in him becoming the leader he always wanted to be. While Sokka always had the desire to lead, if not for his journey that gifted him both perspective and humility, I could not see him being prepared to lead the attack during the Day of the Black Sun, or think on his feet to prevent the destruction of the Earth Kingdom. The key being that in these moments of triumph, Sokka was not doing so for his own vanity or bravado, but because it was simply what needed to be done. In addition to having one of the more original arcs of the show, Sokka also carries the distinction of having the most well-developed romantic storyline. Though to be fair, that isn't saying all that much. While I suppose one could argue that Sokka's romance with Yue was a bit sudden, I consider this only a minor criticism, as not only are youthful romances often of the impulsive madcap variety, but it gives her sacrifice come the finale that much more emotional impact. Furthermore, I appreciate the show exploring how the trauma of losing Yue results in Sokka being hesitant to pursue a romance with Suki. I can't say whether or not the writers planned out the trajectory of Sokka and Suki's relationship from the get-go, but I am glad to see that, rather than them having Sokka completely forget about or just get over Yue at the drop of a cabbage, they made him grapple with the pain of losing someone he cared for, and how this in turn makes him fear getting close to someone else. I am so used to seeing shows where romances and relationships are established simply to drum up some contrived dramatic tension, only to be dropped like hot potatoes once they've run their course and have little to no consequence on the characters moving forward. So the fact that the show actually addressed Sokka's turmoil over losing Yue and how it gives him hesitations about being with Suki, rather than just writing it off as inconsequential, was very impressive. All in all, I think Sokka's role in the series is essential, as it communicates to the audience that anyone, no matter what hand they have been dealt, has the potential to amount to some truly amazing feats, that even someone who on the surface may seem unspectacular, through determination, humility, and courage, can be a hero all the same. This is a theme I fear is lost on a number of other fantasy series. You don't have to be arbitrarily sensitive to midi-chlorians or be the spawn of a notable somebody to utilize the power of the Force. You don't have to have special genes to have the capability to perform amazing spells and enchantments. being a true warrior requires discipline and self-belief, as opposed to being imbued with fuck, what was it? Was it ki? No, that's from Neo. Mana? No, I'm thinking of Budokai. I should stop guessing. I feel like I'm going to say something culturally insensitive. The point I am trying to make is that even in a world of prophetic messiahs, elemental masters, and melon lords, just becoming the best version of you is all you need to do to make a difference.
Did you really just say that?
Yes. Although just because something is trite doesn't make it any less chi. That's it. Fucked. Believe it or not, there was a time when I would have opened this segment by stating Katara's characterization was my biggest disappointment of the entire series. However, that was prior to Book 3, in which the writers were able to rediscover her primary inner conflict and bring her arc to a brilliantly cathartic conclusion. As for her arc throughout Book 1 and 2, I have some words. In contrast to Sokka, Zuko, and Aang, whose arc trajectories, I would say, are clearly telegraphed from very early on in the series, I found Katara's to be unfocused and even confounding at times, it feeling as if the writers weren't entirely sure where they wanted to take her character. In the very first scene of the series, it is established that following her mother's murder, Katara had to take on a more maternal role within her tribe, and that she resents how this prevented her from pursuing her desire to become a waterbender. Katara is finally given the chance to achieve said desire upon her and Sokka's discovery of Aang. The trio later setting course for the Northern Water Tribe, where Katara hopes to find a waterbending teacher and reach her full potential. Now, at first glance, it appears Katara's primary character conflict is obvious. Her being torn between her duty as a maternal figure for those she cares for and her desire of becoming a waterbender. However, the issue is that, following the first couple of episodes, these two things never clash in any way. Throughout Book 1, we see her embrace her caring role to give hope and comfort to those in need, and we also see her hone her waterbending skills. At no point does one hinder or stand in the way of the other. It isn't even a matter of finding balance, really, since there is never a moment where she has to choose between these two aspects of her personality. Now, you could argue that, well, Katara's arc isn't about some war raging within her. It is simply about her continuing to be a source of hope and comfort for others while also being given the chance to become a waterbending master. And I would be fine with that. The issue is that the writers completely flubbed this idea come the end of Book 1. Upon reaching the Northern Water Tribe, Katara is devastated when Master Pakku refuses to train her in waterbending combat on account of her being a chick, and later challenges him to a duel in order to prove her capabilities. Frankly, this whole beat seemed really out of place, seeing as, instead of shoehorning in forced girl power moments, the series successfully highlights its female characters by simply showing them as capable and layered individuals. So yeah, it's probably one of the most cliche moments of the series for me, but I guess it isn't all that egregious. However, its resolution I find utterly baffling. So after Katara impresses Pakku with her abilities, she's like, okay, so now will you teach me waterbending? And Pakku's like, I totally would. Too bad you're still a chick. But then we discover that Pakku was engaged to Katara's grandmother way back when, and that she left him due to the tribe's sexist customs. And it is only after this that Pakku decides to take Katara on as a student, which I consider to be a very strange way to resolve this story beat. Obviously, I get the point the writers are trying to make. Pakku realizes his stubborn outlook cost him the love of his life, so he decides to reconsider his worldview. Cool, but then that makes Katara proving herself to him seem inconsequential. Why even have them fight at all? Why not just have Pakku recognize the necklace before they square off? I can't help but feel as if Katara is being robbed of her victory. Instead of it being her skill and determination that makes Pakku reconsider his ways, it is depicted as at best secondary as to why he ends up doing so. Come to think of it, we never even get confirmation that Pakku has changed at all. Yes, he agrees to teach Katara, but that doesn't mean he plans to take on other female students in the future. Even in the next episode, Katara is the sole female pupil, Maybe he's just doing it out of a soft spot for her grandmother, or he views her as an exception to the rule. But putting that aside, then comes a bigger issue, namely, Pakku assigning Katara as Aang's waterbending master, which makes little sense seeing as there was an entire episode dedicated exclusively to illustrating Aang being much more of a natural waterbender than her. So the idea that over such a small time frame she seemingly surpassed him doesn't really add up. I could definitely buy this, say, come book 3, since Aang has to spread his focus among all 4 elements, but not as soon as the end of book 1. If Katara's arc is supposed to be about becoming a waterbending master, it seems like once again Katara is getting gypped by having so much of her development and improvement only being implied or glossed over. But then there comes an even bigger issue, which is, following her being named Aang's waterbending master at the beginning of book 2, well, she kind of enters no man's land in terms of her character arc. If her arc was meant to be about breaking free from the box she was put into following her mother's death and becoming a waterbender, well, then her arc is basically complete, no? She's accomplished everything she is set out to do. I would say this is the reason Katara's development feels like it stagnates throughout book 2, a sentiment held by other fans I have talked to. Now, I don't entirely agree with this take, as I feel Katara and Toph's initial hostility towards each other and their eventual reconciliation serves her character well, with Katara realizing that she doesn't always have to play the mother role. But all in all, I think Katara really gets the short end of the stick when it comes to development in book 2. Her character is by no means ruined or anything, but it definitely feels like she comes to a standstill. Because, again, where is there left for her to go? It seems like she has made peace with and found balance in regard to her role as the maternal figure of the group and has honed her waterbending. So, now what? By the end of book 2, I would say we have some sense of the endgame for Aang, Zuko, and Sokka. But what about Katara? What is the beat that solidifies and serves as a conclusion to her arc? Heading into book 3, I was anxious that Katara would become more or less a stock character meant to solely serve the development of other characters. With only one book left, would it be possible for the writers to get her development back on track and bring her story to a cathartic and satisfying end? Oh fuck yeah, they did. With the 3 Katara-centric episodes of book 3, the writers made me do a complete 180 on my perception of her arc. And they did so by honing in on an aspect of her character that, in retrospect, was always bubbling just beneath the surface, but wasn't brought to a boil until book 3. And that is the resentment she feels over her mother's death. I know that sounds strange, considering Katara is often poked fun at by the fandom due to her mentioning her mother's death more often than Iroh brings up tea, or Zuko delivers a diatribe about something ma honor. But the focus has been primarily on the grief and trauma Katara holds over losing her mother. However, beyond this, there is resentment over what occurred as a result. Her being robbed of her childhood, her having to play mother for everyone else, her being denied the chance to pursue her own desires. This resentment is clearly demonstrated in the opening scene of the series. Katara isn't just angry because she lost her mother, she is angry because she lost so much more as a result. But this isn't explored all that much. That is until we arrive at book 3. On my first watch, I was confused as to why the writers added the beat of Katara being angry at her father. It seemed to come out of nowhere, only to be resolved rather quickly. But now I see how vital it was. Despite Katara understanding why her father had to leave her and Sokka, that doesn't mean she doesn't feel anger over him doing so. While some may consider this an instance of her being selfish, I consider it utterly human. And it is in this aspect of Katara's psyche where I feel the writers finally found the heart, the pulse, if you will, of her arc. Katara has been the emotional center of the group through and through. But that is a great deal of emotional bandwidth for anyone to take on, let alone a young girl. And book 3 is where we finally start to see her approach her breaking point. Thus, her primary character conflict is finally established. Katara is faced with the ultimatum of letting go of her anger, her resentment, of allowing her empathy to extend even to those a part of her may want to despise, or allowing it to consume her, turning her into her greatest fear, a shadow of who she once was, the haunting specter of whom Katara is faced with in Hama, whose bitterness has eroded her soul, leaving her devoid of joy and absent of love. And when Katara is ultimately given the chance to deliver retribution to the one responsible for all of her pain, an empty shell of a man who possesses none of the mercy or compassion she desperately clings to even after so much heartbreak, betrayal, and loss, she is able to find the courage to not sacrifice who she is, not expelling her grief, but overcoming it nonetheless, maintaining her optimism and hope even through the most testing of times. And come the most decisive moment of her journey, she finds the strength to fight side by side with her former enemy, not to satiate the desire for vengeance that nearly made her lose sight of who she was, but to protect those she loves, who make her who she is. Over the several months it took me to put out this video, the one question I received the most, over and over, from both my Discord peeps and you macabros here on YouTube was, what did I think of Zuko's arc? I was subjected to y'all lavishing non-stop praise upon what some would call one of the finest character arcs in television history. And you know what? It kind of irked me. Kind of rustled my jimmies a bit. Ignited the wick of the inner obnoxious contrarian that resides in the depths of my pretentious soul. And thus, my elitist, snobby ass made it my mission to find at least one thing I could critique. One aspect I could find fault in. One fucking little pinch of criticism I could bring to the table to prove to you emotionally stunted, frothing at the mouth, jerk-off fanboys that I was intellectually superior to each and every single one of you. But alas, I now present myself prostrate before you as a fellow emotionally stunted, frothing at the mouth, jerk-off fanboy. It's perfect. It's so fucking good, it's almost stupid. I even cheated and tried to find a decent critique of his arc online from someone else, only to find myself critiquing their critique. It's like someone took everything I have ever said on this channel about character development and arc pacing and rolled it all into a single, brooding, ponytailed little bastard. Me now seeing just how much of an influence Zuko's arc has had on practically the last 15 or so years of media. There's very little I can add to the pot as to what makes Zuko's arc so exceedingly excellent. So I'll just discuss a few things that I think are the keys to its success. Things other shows that attempt to portray similarly styled arcs fail to implement and or execute properly, thus resulting in them failing to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was Zuko. The first thing that stands out is how Zuko's character trajectory is predominantly disconnected from the other main characters and even to an extent the major overarching narrative of the show. That isn't to say he has no bearing on the plot or that his actions don't affect and intersect with the others, simply that the bulk of his screen time is focused almost entirely on developing his character, in contrast to say the other members of Team Avatar, who, while they are given plenty of development, also share a lot of their screen time with the unfolding of one-off plots, the development of more minor characters, world building, exposition, etc. Almost every scene with Zuko is in service to him alone, allowing the writers to hone in on his development without having to juggle a bunch of other stuff. The second is that Zuko is far from what anyone would characterize as evil when we first meet him. He is a confused, conflicted kid currently on the wrong path. He is yet to reach a point where his eventual turn to the light seems unrealistically contrived. Nor has he done so much bad that his redemption comes off as condescending. The show knows that if Zuko were too much of a horrible little prick when we first catch up with him, we wouldn't accept him eventually forsaking his past ways. It's not like the writers considered giving Sozin or fucking Ozai a path to moral redemption. Or at least I hope they didn't. That isn't to say you can't give certain villainous characters empathetic backstories that explain how they ended up the way they are, but that doesn't mean the narrative vindicates them from or tries to retroactively sanitize the horrible actions they have committed. When we first catch up with Zuko, it is at a very decisive period in his life, where we can still buy into the idea that he possesses the will to turn things around. I might even go so far as to say that calling Zuko's arc one of redemption is misleading, as it isn't really about an evil person becoming righteous, but rather us hoping he is able to change his path before he becomes too far gone. However, I would say the primary reason Zuko's arc unfolds in such picture-perfect fashion is undoubtedly its masterful pacing, with each book of the show performing a particular function in service of his overall development, akin to 3-act structure. And per traditional 3-act structure, Book 1 is all about establishing. I'd argue Zuko undergoes very little change in Book 1, as, all the way up until the finale, his objective and general disposition remains roughly the same. But this is fine because Book 1 is about setting up Zuko's character, what drives him, what haunts him. The show takes its time laying the foundation of Zuko's characterization so it can be built and expanded upon come Book 2, which is my own personal favorite segment of Zuko's arc, in which he becomes a far more dynamic character, where we see cracks begin to form in said foundation, making way for growth. Following he and Iroh being forced to become fugitives from the Fire Nation, Zuko is, for perhaps the first time in his life, forced to gain perspective. He is humbled upon having the struggle to survive. He begins to see the merits of a simple life of serving others, that he can achieve honor not by kowtowing to the desires of those who have immiserated him his entire life, but by defending those who have suffered and been crushed beneath the heel of his own father's oppressive regime. That the chance of a fulfilling, happy life exists for him beyond what he has always known. Yet he is plagued by lingering feelings of shame and guilt for what he has left behind, for everything he has done up until this point, by the fear that there will be those who will never forgive him, who will not allow him to walk away from who he used to be. His past like a scar he cannot conceal. Thus, we see him flirt with succumbing to a life of crime, of dishonor, of believing that he is not worthy of redemption, resulting in him backsliding into his old ways and culminating in a devastating yet fair reversal, where we are forced to bear witness to Zuko descending down the wrong path once again. And yet come Book 3, despite having attained seemingly everything he has always wanted, the conflict within him persists, like a splinter in his soul, keeping him from being content with his choice, leading to him ultimately deciding to walk his own path, finding the courage to turn his back on everything he has ever known, everything he has always wanted, and, despite having forsaken those who believed in him, despite having no one by his side, despite having to face this entirely new world all on his own, he refuses to sacrifice his chance, his last chance, to forge his own destiny. While Zuko's renouncement of Ozai is perhaps the most cathartic and brilliant payoff of the series, I was mainly impressed by how the writers made him earn his second chance. Often an issue with many redemption arcs is they build up to the moment where a particular character decides to leave behind their previous ways and live a life of righteousness, but then it just ends, with them not facing the consequences of and or sufficiently making amends for their past actions. But with Zuko, we spend almost the entire back half of Season 3 seeing him earn his redemption, gaining the trust of those he once stood as antagonist to, proving that he has truly become a different person, him ultimately helping his former adversaries face off against his own kin, and risking his own life to put an end to their rule once and for all. I think it is this segment of his arc in particular that allows it to stick the landing, us bearing witness to him putting in the work, earning his second chance, proving to us that he is truly changed, thus ensuring that come the end of the series, as he takes his place as the Fire Lord alongside Aang, that the world is now in good hands. But of course, Lest we not forget that while Zuko's arc emphasizes that one has the ability to choose their own destiny, it also highlights the vital importance of having someone who believes in and, no matter what, refuses to give up on you. At the beginning of the show, I thought Iroh was going to be a menial side character, restricted solely to the role of comic relief, given his apparent blasé attitude and laid-back demeanor. Yet I was swiftly and gladly proven wrong. Us learning his desire for a life of peace and tranquility is as a result of seeing where a lifetime of war and conquest leads him to. Him forsaking his old ways and adopting a new way of life. Of appreciating small, simple pleasures, of extending warmth and kindness any chance you can, of not taking a single moment for granted. Iroh's love for Zuko being his paramount trait, him firmly communicating his wish for his nephew to forsake an existence driven by the desire to attain power over others, while simultaneously allowing Zuko to make his own choices, both the good and the bad, knowing it is necessary for Zuko to choose his own path on his own accord, who cares more about the fate of his nephew than himself, who stops at nothing to urge him to see the light before it is too late, because, sadly, he himself has already paid the ultimate price. While he was never driven by attaining glory or redemption for himself, his efforts and acts of empathy and kindness are nonetheless rewarded come the finale, him being reunited with Zuko, seeing his nephew has heeded his guidance and chosen to live a pure, righteous life. He, the man who came the closest anyone ever has to conquering the city of Ba Sing Se for the purpose of claiming it in the name of the Fire Nation, years later, defending said city against his own clan. Bro has officially joined, and dare I say topped, my list of goated TV uncles. Even if I were to judge the show on the tale of these two alone, it would still make it something truly special. I was utterly blown away. No fucking notes. So, seeing as I have spent the last 90 minutes or so mostly heaping praise upon the series, I figured I'd attempt to balance the scale by closing things out with perhaps my biggest critique of the entire show. The omission of an aspect of Aang's character arc which I believe seriously cheapens his development. To be clear, I am not saying his arc is by any means poor. A young boy who has had everything he knows and loves stripped from him, who has had an immense responsibility thrust upon him, who is faced with hardship, struggle, defeat, who must overcome guilt, shame, and self-doubt in order to fulfill his destiny, who he is and what he cherishes conflicting with what he must do to bring peace to the world. Even if Aang is able to physically best Ozai, will he be able to bring himself to deliver the killing blow, even if it means sacrificing perhaps the only aspect of his culture, his identity, he has left? Yet, despite how perfectly Aang's final conflict seems to be constructed, I find that it is missing one crucial piece. And to aid me in articulating my argument, I would like to present a counterexample. I guess for this video, I am substituting my obligatory half dozen or so Sopranos references for Star Wars.
Twisted fucking bitch.
For our purposes, I want to outline Luke's final conflict towards the end of The Return of the Jedi. Come the climax of our story, Luke is brought to the Emperor, who attempts to entice Luke to give into his anger and join the Empire. Luke attacks the Emperor, which leads to him squaring off with Darth Vader. Luke is able to best Vader and has him at his mercy, the Emperor urging Luke to kill his own father, knowing that doing so will result in hate consuming Luke and him falling to the dark side. What is so brilliant about Luke's final conflict is that it's constructed as a double-edged sword. If Luke refuses to kill Vader, he will die, the rebels will be defeated, and Leia will be hunted and likely killed. So obviously, Luke can't let that happen. Now, in a lesser story, this would simply be a case of the good guy killing the bad guy. Luke kills Vader, he kills the Emperor, the rebels win, happy ending. But, of course, things aren't that easy. Because if Luke does best Vader and slays the Emperor, then he risks being consumed by the dark side. no matter which option he decides, there are grave consequences. So with that in mind, let's compare Luke's final conflict to Aang's. Aang must choose between sparing Ozai, which while it will allow him to maintain his principle of never using violence to take a life, will lead to Ozai continuing his reign of terror, or killing him, thus sparing the lives of countless innocents and bringing peace to the world once more, even though it will result in Aang betraying his oath of pacifism, thus leading to... Well, actually, I'm not really sure. And thus we come to my main issue with the conclusion of Aang's arc. That is not to say that I don't empathize with Aang's perspective. After having his people genocided, his culture decimated, his identity stripped from him, I understand why he is so hesitant to sacrifice the one part of his ideology he has left by killing Ozai. But let us consider for a moment, what if he did? What would be the consequence? Well, I'm sure he'd be upset. I'm sure he'd be in turmoil. I'm sure it would weigh heavy on his heart. But he'd probably get over it, right? After enough time, after seeing the peace and prosperity it has brought to the world, after realizing it prevented the torturous subjugation of every innocent soul in the land and the painful death of every single person he cares about. And even if he didn't, even if this is something that will haunt him for the rest of his life, wouldn't that be his cross to bear? The recurring theme throughout Aang's arc is the idea, even though he did not ask to be the Avatar, even though him being unwillingly shouldered with such an immense responsibility is completely unfair, he still has to rise to the occasion and do what must be done. With this in mind, it makes his resistance against killing Ozai almost come off as selfish, dare I say even petulant. It would be like me allowing me and my girlfriend to get evicted because writing the rent check makes my wrist cramp up. I know such a frivolous metaphor risks trivializing Aang's struggle, which, as I said, I think is valid, but I use it to illustrate the massive imbalance of consequences. Yes, Aang, we know how important your beliefs are to you, but when the alternative is literally Fire Hitler killing you, your friends, their parents, and every innocent soul on the planet being indefinitely persecuted under his sociopathic reign, for Christ's sake, just write the fucking check. Even after he confides in Roku, Kyoshi, and Kurok, all of whom, while they empathize with his situation, advise him to nut up and get the job done, Aang calls upon Yang Chen, a fellow airbender, thinking, oh, she will understand my perspective. But even she's like, bro, stop the cap and just do it. This scene in particular I couldn't help but think was slightly humorous. It's like when your friend has like a really shitty girlfriend and like knows deep down he should break up with her, so he asks his boys for advice, hoping they will tell him what he wants to hear so he can stay with her, but then they're all like, nah man, I'm actually glad you brought this up. That bitch is toxic as hell. You gotta ditch her crazy ass. But then he just ignores them and is like, nah man, they don't know her like I do. Again, to reiterate, I don't want to downplay Aang's inner turmoil about killing Ozai. I simply am illustrating that, when compared to the alternative, pretty much everyone, including the one person who above anyone else totally understands and relates to his situation, unanimously agrees this is a complete no-brainer. If we compare this to Luke's final decision, you can see the major difference. It isn't just that Luke doesn't want to kill Vader. I mean, obviously he doesn't, but he probably would if he absolutely had to. But there is a more tangible danger to him doing so, namely him falling to the dark side. It isn't just that he would be in despair over killing his own father, there is a very severe consequence to him doing so that could lead to a just as bad, if not worse, outcome. This is what makes Luke's final conflict so damn gripping. Now, to be fair, despite Aang's initial resistance against the idea of killing Ozai, he does eventually resolve that he's going to have to do so in the end. My issue is how the conflict is set up in and of itself. We get Aang doesn't want to kill Ozai, but to me, the show didn't adequately explore what the consequences would be if he did end up going through with it, either for the world or himself. Hence, cheapening his final major conflict. So, with that in mind, is there a way we could make Aang's final dilemma more equally measured? Well, let's take a look. One of the primary facets of Aang's arc is him struggling with having his identity, his culture, stripped away from him. This is the primary reason as to why he is so reluctant to kill Ozai. He has lost so much of his identity that he wants to hang on to the one thing, the only thing he has left. But what if there was a more tangible consequence to Aang snuffing out Ozai? What if Aang was afraid that sacrificing the last shred of his identity would result in him losing his sense of self, his moral compass, his instinct for right and wrong? And as a result, he could no longer trust himself to control the immense power he has been bestowed with. The idea of Aang losing control over his power is depicted throughout the series, namely in Book 1, where, after discovering his people were massacred, he enters the Avatar state in a rage, almost harming Katara and Sokka, and later in Book 2, after discovering that Appa was taken captive. Not only did he become furious with Toph, despite there being nothing she could have done to stop it, but he may have ended up harming the Sand Sailors who took Appa, if not for the intervention of Katara. I really like this idea of Aang being stuck between a rock and a hard place. How in order to become the Avatar, he has to detach himself from his worldly needs, particularly his love for Katara, as noted at the end of Book 2. But that if he does so, if he is forced to sacrifice too much of who he is, then what is there to stop him from losing control, of becoming just as much of a threat to the balance of the world as Ozai? Sadly, however, I don't really think they went as deep as they could have with this concept. I actually think this was one aspect of the whole Avatar mythos that was underdeveloped, namely the fallibility of the Avatars themselves. Again, there are hints of this throughout the series, namely Kurok citing his laid-back attitude for causing the death of his wife Umi and later his own at the hands of Ko, and Roku, blinded by his sensitivity for Sozin, being unable to stop him before it cost him his life. But I wish they went further. For example, what if it turns out there was an Avatar who at one point lost their way, who instead of using their power to bring peace to the world, attempted to conquer it, who ultimately had to be killed to put an end to their terror, with the people of the world left with only the hope that the next Avatar would not follow suit? Maybe the other Avatars decided to conceal the existence of this evil Avatar in order to maintain the legend of the Avatar as an all-righteous beacon of goodness. Perhaps at some point, Aang could learn of this Avatar. Perhaps we could rework the Avatar Day episode. Instead of having Chin Village hate the Avatar because of a misunderstanding, have Aang discover a small, remote people who despise the Avatar because said evil Avatar decimated their people long ago. This would in turn make Aang begin to doubt himself, not just about if he will be able to defeat Ozai, not just about if he can bring himself to kill Ozai, but if he does, will sacrificing the last part of his identity lead to him, instead of becoming the hero the world needs, taking on the role of its villain? Not only do I think this would lead to Aang's final dilemma about whether or not to kill Ozai being that much more tumultuous, but it would fit perfectly with one of the primary themes of the show, namely that every person has it within them to choose their path. Introducing the idea that even the Avatar could become corrupted would emphasize the themes of free will and choice in regard to Aang's arc just as much as Zuko's. This is yet another issue that comes as a result of this angle of Aang's arc not being present. I'd say it's obvious that there is a very deliberate effort by the writers to frame Aang and Zuko as two sides of the same coin, if you will. But while with Zuko, there was always a tension between which way he would go, whether he would eventually see the light and become a true man of honor, or if he would allow his father's influence to poison his soul. I never got a real sense of duality with Aang. Even despite these hints of him losing control, I never felt as though there was ever a chance that he could possibly fall to the dark side, if you will. In the finale, I actually think there is a line that kind of hints at this, when Aang says,
I can't just go around wiping out people I don't like.
Here, it almost makes it seem as if Aang is insinuating that if he kills Ozai, what is to stop him from just killing anyone who stands in his way later down the line? However, again, it doesn't take it far enough, not really delving into the idea that he could lose his moral compass. Also, another issue is the context. Aang isn't talking about someone he just doesn't like, as he puts it. Again, we're dealing with Fire Hitler here. Furthermore, it's like, well, I mean, obviously you shouldn't just kill whoever you don't like, but as the Avatar, it is sort of your job to make some pretty hard calls to keep the peace. You can't just wait until someone commits a full-on genocide so you can justify taking them out yourself. That was literally the point that both Kyoshi and Roku were trying to beat into your bald-ass head. But I digress. I think by adding this more tangible consequence of Aang killing Ozai, it would make his final conflict that much more equally measured. I could see an ending where Aang does end up killing Ozai and, having lost the last of his identity, begins to lose himself, and we fear he may turn tyrannical, or, at the very least, be unable to effectively perform his duties as peacekeeper of the world. But by embracing the times he has shared with those he has come to love over the course of the series, he is able to hang on to who he truly is. Maybe the real Avatar was the friends we made along the way. However, you could argue that my entire premise of Aang possibly going bad is antithetical to the point the ending is trying to make, which is that Aang must grapple with betraying one of the core principles of his culture. While I am arguing for a more tangible, consequential scenario where Aang going bad results in widespread chaos and destruction, for Aang, even if that would never happen, him killing Ozai and betraying the entire foundation of his philosophy would be catastrophic for, perhaps not the world at large, but for Aang himself. Even putting aside the argument that Nickelodeon would never be chill with Aang killing Ozai, him doing so would go against the point the ending was trying to make, which is that one can always find a way to solve one's problems while sticking to their beliefs. Like I said, I think this is a bit antithetical to everything the show has set up leading up to this point, but I can at least recognize that this is the point the writers were making with their intended resolution to the series. However, this leads to quite the conundrum for the writers. In order for Aang to stick true to his principles, he can't kill Ozai. But Ozai still has to be dispatched with somehow. Return of the Jedi sidesteps this issue due to how the story is structured. Yes, Luke prevents himself from falling to the dark side by refusing to kill Vader, but his decision to do so inspires Vader to forsake the Emperor and yeet his ass over a railing. But in Avatar, since there is no third party that plays Vader's role, this doesn't really work. If Aang decided to spare Ozai, I mean, that'd be cool, but considering Ozai is a psychopathic tyrant, I doubt he would be inspired to put the gloves down and all of a sudden opt to just enjoy a calming cup of jasmine tea. He would still have to be dealt with one way or another. Thus, this is why the writers introduced energy bending. And as for that, I already discussed the issues I have with its execution. Come to think of it though, in retrospect, the introduction of energy bending, particularly what I brought up earlier about the risk of utilizing it, leads to another little snag in the ending. As I said, I do think the writers had good instincts, hence why they added a level of stakes to energy bending, namely Aang risking his own destruction, as opposed to it being just a complete OP trump card. However, you could then argue that this makes Aang deciding to forgo killing Ozai and instead use energy bending, once again, pretty selfish and even downright irresponsible. Like, imagine if Aang tells the squad about how he defeated Ozai, and then they're like, whoa. So let me get this straight. It was over. You had Ozai dead to rights. You could have just snapped the motherfucker's neck and been done with it. But instead, you decided to utilize energy bending, which, if it failed, would have resulted in you dying, which presumably would then leave Ozai free to continue his destructive rampage? Oh, well, when you put it like that. So yeah, I'm not saying that I think Aang's arc in the show is bad by any means. I understand what the writers were going for and why they made the decisions they did while still adhering to the restrictions they had to deal with, even if I found the overall execution to be a bit of a letdown. Anyway, let's wrap things up. While part of me laments that I waited so long to give this series the time of day, ultimately, I am glad I got to experience it for the first time as an adult. As I said, I have been aware of the show's stellar reputation for quite some time, but I am also keen on the opinion of some that the show is in fact decent at best and is only held in high regard due to the chokehold of nostalgia. I won't deny that I agree that at least some of its wide acclaim is perhaps as a result of rose-colored glasses. But there are plenty of shows that I personally am nostalgic for that I don't consider towering masterpieces. It's not like you're ever going to see me do a deep dive on the groundbreaking cultural impact of Cat Dog. So I don't think nostalgia alone explains why Avatar: The Last Airbender has made such an impact on so many. Okay, so what then? Well, after sitting with my thoughts for unfortunately much longer than I expected, I think the answer as to why the show holds such a cherished place in the hearts of those who grew up watching it is that it was one of, if not the first pieces of media that took them seriously as viewers, that didn't underestimate their intelligence, that didn't doubt their capability to grapple with moral complexity, that didn't presume that just because they were kids, they couldn't resonate with such layered characters. Adolescents thrust into a world filled with uncertainty and conflict, faced with seemingly insurmountable adversity and having their preconceived notions of the world shattered before their very eyes. Being shouldered with an overwhelming amount of responsibility they neither asked for nor believe they can overcome, yet ultimately finding the strength to dispel their doubts, conquer their fears, and live up to the expectations of those who depend on and care for them. I mean, how could a growing kid ever relate to any of that? In a time where it seems like so many writers feel the need to dumb down their stories to the lowest common denominator, which only results in their audience being bored to tears by the same cookie-cutter schlock they have seen countless times before, and insulted by the insinuation that they can't handle nor do they crave media that sets out to challenge them, it was redeeming to see so many fans who even to this day express such elated passion for a series simply because it was the first time they were given the respect they deserve as viewers. And I can only hope that they won't be the last.